On a quiet Sunday morning, Jerry and Sally prepared for church, their home bathed in soft sunlight. Years of routine made the day feel ordinary, but something about the stillness carried unease. As Jerry adjusted his tie and Sally poured coffee, shadows danced where light should reign, unnoticed by them. The church was peaceful, a sanctuary of quiet devotion. Stained glass painted the congregation in soft, fragmented light as hymns faded into solemn prayer. Yet, an unnatural heaviness crept into the air, subtle, almost imperceptible. Shadows stretched in ways they shouldn't, hinting at something unseen, lurking just beyond comprehension. The serene atmosphere shattered in an instant. A single, piercing scream ripped through the silence, echoing off the stone walls of the old church. The congregation froze, heads snapping up in confusion and fear, eyes scanning for the source. The scream was unlike anything they had ever heard, guttural, primal, as if it had been wrenched from the depths of the earth itself. A woman in the front row was the first to react. She fell back, clutching at her chest, her face contorted in sheer terror. But as the others turned to see what had caused the scream, what they saw next made their blood run cold. At the front of the room, standing where the woman had just been, was something wrong. A creature, a grotesque, unnatural figure, towered above them, its body twisted and malformed. Its legs were long and gnarled, the skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too large for its frame. Its arms hung loosely by its sides, ending in sharp, jagged claws that scraped against the floor with each subtle movement. The face was the most horrifying part, eyes glowing with an unnatural yellow light, sunken deep into its skull. The nose was flattened, the mouth stretched into a grotesque snarl that revealed rows of jagged teeth, sharp and inhuman. The beast's fur was patchy, dark and matted, but it wasn't just the physical appearance that left the congregation paralyzed with fear. It was the aura, the oppressive presence that hung in the air around it, thick with malevolence, cold as death itself. The creature growled, a low, rumbling sound that echoed in the bones of every person in the room. It was like nothing they had ever heard before, a sound both animalistic and unnatural. As the growl reverberated through the church, some of the congregation screamed and bolted for the exits, but others, like Jerry and Sally, were frozen in place. Sally's hand tightened around her husband's arm, her nails digging into his flesh as her eyes locked onto the creature, unable to look away. The beast's glare was intense, its yellow eyes flickering with something almost intelligent, a malevolent intelligence, like it was sizing them up, determining how best to strike. From the back of the room, security guards rushed forward, their movements panicked as they tried to contain the situation. They were no match for the creature's strength. As they approached, the beast turned to face them, letting out a deafening roar that seemed to vibrate the very walls. The guards hesitated, fear creeping into their faces as they realized the magnitude of what they were confronting. Some tried to subdue it with force, but their efforts were futile. The creature shrugged them off with terrifying ease, its strength far greater than anything they could manage. Panic spread like wildfire, and the room descended into chaos. People screamed, some ran, and others huddled together, praying that whatever this thing was, it would pass them by. Jerry looked to Sally, his face pale with terror, but his voice was steady as he whispered, "Stay close to me." Sally clung to him, her heart racing, her eyes never leaving the beast, which seemed to be reveling in the fear it caused. It was as though it fed off their terror, its glowing eyes gleaming brighter with each passing moment. Then, from the pulpit, a voice rang out, loud, authoritative, and unwavering. It was the pastor, stepping forward, Bible in hand, his gaze fixed on the creature before him. The pastor didn't hesitate, despite the danger. His voice boomed through the church, calling out in a language unfamiliar to everyone present. Words that carried power, ancient and commanding. The creature snarled in response, its body shifting with aggression, but it remained rooted in place. The air around them seemed to pulse with an invisible force, thickening as the pastor's words grew louder, more insistent. The tension in the room was suffocating. The beast's eyes flickered and dimmed, but it was still there, standing strong despite the pastor's chants. Every time the pastor spoke, the creature seemed to weaken, its stance unsteady, but it fought to hold its ground. It was as if the creature was being drawn into a battle, one not of strength, but of will, of something far older and more powerful than any of them could comprehend. The church trembled under the weight of fear. Every soul inside was paralyzed, caught between the instinct to flee and the morbid pull of the unexplainable. The grotesque figure at the front of the room loomed larger than life, its presence suffocating and surreal. Growls reverberated off the wooden walls, blending with the terrified whispers of the congregation. Yet, through the chaos, one figure remained steady, the pastor, an unassuming man in his late 40s with thinning hair and a deep conviction in his faith, stepped forward. His hands clutched a weathered Bible, its corners frayed from years of use. His movements were deliberate but filled with tension, as if every step took an enormous effort. He did not waver, though the beast's glowing yellow eyes fixed on him, narrowing in challenge. The creature tilted its head slightly, studying him, its lips pulling back to reveal rows of jagged teeth that dripped with some dark, unidentifiable substance. "Stay back," someone from the congregation shouted, their voice high with panic. Others began murmuring prayers under their breath, some sobbing openly, while a few clung to each other in desperate silence. The pastor raised his hand, signaling for calm, though he did not take his eyes off the creature. Jerry and Sally sat frozen in the second row. Sally gripped Jerry's arm so tightly her knuckles were white, but neither of them could tear their gaze away from the confrontation unfolding just feet in front of them. Jerry's mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible sight before him. The creature, was it a demon? A beast? A figment of their collective fear? None of it made sense. Yet here it was, growling and snarling in the flesh, or something like flesh. The pastor began to speak, his voice steady but filled with an almost unnatural resonance. "In the name of the Almighty, I command you to reveal yourself." His words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive, as if the room itself was reacting to them. The creature snarled, jerking its head back as though struck by an invisible force. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, its claws digging into the floorboards as it regained its balance. The sound of wood splintering echoed through the church. The pastor continued, his voice growing louder. "You have no power here. You are not welcome in this house of God." As he spoke, his words shifted into a language no one recognized. The syllables were harsh and guttural, yet they carried an unmistakable authority. The air seemed to vibrate with their power, a low hum that grew with each word. The creature roared in defiance, its body twisting unnaturally as if resisting some unseen force. Its eyes flared brighter for a moment, and it lunged toward the pastor, stopping just short as though held back by an invisible barrier. The congregation gasped, several people screaming as the beast let out another earth-shaking growl. Jerry's breath caught in his throat. His rational mind fought against what his senses were telling him, but there was no denying what he was witnessing. "What is he saying?" Sally whispered, her voice trembling. Jerry shook his head, he had no answers. The battle continued. The pastor stood firm, his chants growing louder, more insistent. Each word seemed to push the creature back, inch by inch, though it clawed and fought with every ounce of strength it had. The air in the church grew colder, and a faint mist began to form around the creature. It snarled and thrashed, its movements becoming erratic, almost desperate, but it wasn't giving up. Instead, it began to speak, or rather, something spoke through it. The congregation fell silent as a guttural, echoing voice emerged from the beast. The language was incomprehensible, but its tone was clear, mocking, threatening, filled with rage. The creature's eyes locked onto the pastor, its lips curling into a grotesque approximation of a grin. The words it spoke reverberated unnaturally, as though coming from somewhere far beyond the physical form it inhabited. The pastor faltered for a brief moment, his expression flickering with doubt. The congregation collectively held their breath, the tension in the room reaching a breaking point. Then, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and resumed his chanting. His voice was louder now, more commanding, each word cutting through the creature's growls like a blade. The mist around the beast thickened, and it began to convulse, its body writhing and twisting as though being pulled apart from within. Jerry glanced around the room. People were gripping their pews, their faces pale and slick with sweat. Some had collapsed to their knees, their hands clasped in desperate prayer. Others had their eyes squeezed shut, unable to bear the sight of the unnatural scene before them. But Jerry couldn't look away. He was transfixed, caught between fear and an almost morbid curiosity. The creature let out a blood-curdling scream, its body buckling as if crushed by an invisible weight. The sound was unbearable, like the wail of a dying animal mixed with something otherworldly. Sally buried her face in Jerry's shoulder, her entire body trembling. "Make it stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The pastor took another step forward, raising the Bible high above his head. His chanting reached a crescendo, the words tumbling from his lips faster now, more urgent. The creature staggered backward, its movements frantic and uncoordinated. Its claws scratched at the air, as though trying to find something to hold onto. Its form began to blur, its edges flickering like a bad signal on an old television. Then, with one final roar, the creature collapsed. Its body hit the ground with a heavy thud, and for a moment, everything was still. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of ragged breathing from the congregation. The pastor lowered the Bible, his hands shaking, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Slowly, the creature began to change. Its grotesque form seemed to shrink, its fur receding, its claws retracting. The congregation watched in stunned silence as the monstrous figure before them transformed into that of a woman, a pale, trembling woman with wild eyes and tattered clothing. She lay motionless on the floor, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The congregation was too shocked to move, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. Jerry looked at Sally, his face pale and his hands trembling. For the first time, he saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. This wasn't something they could explain away. This wasn't something they could forget. Whatever had happened in that church was beyond anything they had ever known. The woman on the floor began to stir, her movements weak and hesitant. The pastor knelt beside her, his voice soft now, though the words he spoke were inaudible to the rest of the congregation. The air in the church felt lighter, as though a great weight had been lifted, but the scars of what had transpired lingered in every corner of the room. The congregation began to murmur, the spell of silence finally breaking. Some rushed to help the woman, while others made for the exits, eager to leave the sight of such horror. Jerry and Sally sat in stunned silence, their hands clasped tightly together. Neither of them spoke. What could they say? How could they put into words the impossible things they had just seen? The pastor rose slowly, his eyes scanning the room. "It's over," he said, his voice weary. But the fear in his eyes suggested otherwise. For Jerry, Sally, and everyone in that church, the nightmare was far from over. The beast collapsed to the church floor with a resounding thud, its grotesque body convulsing violently. The congregation watched in stunned silence, too paralyzed by fear to move or speak. Its snarls turned to low, guttural groans, almost human in their agony. The transformation had begun. The creature's fur, thick and matted, began to recede, revealing pale, clammy skin beneath. Its clawed hands twitched uncontrollably, the sharp talons curling inward as the appendages slowly reshaped into trembling human fingers. The beast's hunched posture straightened out with sickening cracks, its spine shifting and popping into alignment. Muscles contorted, stretched, and shrank, the unnatural strength that once defined the beast melting away with each agonizing second. The congregation sat frozen, their breath shallow, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. For a moment, the beast's face twisted in a grimace of defiance, its glowing yellow eyes glaring one last time at the pastor. But the light in its eyes began to flicker, dimming with every word the pastor spoke. He stood firm, his voice steady yet strained, holding the Bible tightly against his chest as if it were the only barrier between him and the unholy terror before him. Sally clutched Jerry's arm so tightly that her nails dug into his skin, but he didn't flinch. His gaze was fixed on the scene before them, a mixture of disbelief and primal fear etched across his face. His rational mind wanted to look away, to deny the impossible transformation taking place just feet away, but his body betrayed him, holding him captive to the spectacle. As the transformation continued, the creature's face began to change. The elongated snout retracted, its grotesque maw shrinking back into the proportions of a human mouth. The rows of jagged teeth receded, replaced by ordinary, albeit blooded, teeth. Its glowing eyes dimmed completely, the irises darkening to a dull, lifeless brown. The once beast now looked more like a woman, a broken, terrified woman lying crumpled on the cold wooden floor of the church. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Some people crossed themselves, others whispered fervent prayers, while a few stared, frozen in a state of shock. The oppressive air that had filled the church during the ordeal seemed to lift slightly, replaced by an unsettling quiet. The woman, once a monstrous creature, lay motionless, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged breaths. Jerry's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. It's human again." Sally nodded faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. "But how? What was it?" she murmured, her voice trembling. The pastor cautiously approached the woman, his footsteps slow and deliberate. His face was pale, his expression one of deep concern but also weariness. Kneeling beside her, he whispered something that no one could hear. The woman's eyelids fluttered, and she let out a weak, pained groan. Jerry and Sally exchanged a glance, the same thought flashing in their minds: whatever they had witnessed was beyond explanation. The woman, though human now, still carried an air of the supernatural, as if traces of the beast remained just beneath her fragile exterior. As the woman stirred faintly, the pastor gestured for help. Two members of the congregation hesitantly stepped forward, their movements cautious, as though they feared the creature might return at any moment. The woman was lifted gently, her frail frame barely able to stand. The congregation looked on in uneasy silence, their faces pale and filled with questions they dared not voice. Jerry felt a chill run down his spine. The transformation was over, but the dread lingered. The beast may have been subdued, but the fear it brought was alive, woven into the fabric of the church itself. Sally squeezed his arm again, her voice barely audible. "It's not over, is it?" she asked. Jerry shook his head, his eyes locked on the broken figure being carried away. "No," he said quietly. "Not even close." The woman disappeared through the church's side door, leaving behind a congregation forever changed. The church fell into an uneasy silence, the weight of what had transpired pressing heavily on the room. Though the beast was gone, its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to fade. The aftermath left the church in eerie silence, broken only by the creak of wooden pews as the congregation slowly began to stir. Some whispered hurried prayers, their trembling hands clutching rosaries, while others remained frozen, their faces pale and their eyes locked on the space where the creature had stood. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what they had just witnessed. No one dared speak of it aloud, as though naming the terror would summon it back. Jerry and Sally sat motionless, their breath shallow. Sally's grip on Jerry's arm had slackened, but her hand still trembled. She turned to him, her voice a shaky whisper. "What did we just see? What was that a thing?" Jerry shook his head slowly, his lips pressed tightly together. He had no words, no answers, only the hollow echo of fear still gripping his chest. The pastor stood at the pulpit, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a haunted expression. He looked out at the congregation, his eyes scanning the frightened faces before him. Clearing his throat, he finally spoke, his voice unsteady but determined. "What we have witnessed today," he paused, struggling to find the right words, "is not something any of us could have prepared for. But take heart, evil has been cast down. And in its place, we must hold on to faith." His words brought little comfort. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, some questioning what had happened, others insisting they leave immediately. The atmosphere in the church was tense, like a wound barely scabbed over, waiting to reopen. Despite the pastor's reassurances, the fear remained. What if the beast came back? What if it was still here, watching, waiting? Jerry glanced at Sally, who now sat with her head bowed, silently praying. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the events. Was it a demon? A cursed soul? Or something entirely beyond human understanding? Whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain, he and Sally would never see this place the same way again. The sound of footsteps drew his attention. Two men in dark suits entered the church, their movements brisk and purposeful. They spoke quietly with the pastor, who nodded solemnly before addressing the crowd once more. "We've been asked to remain silent about today's events," he said firmly. "For the safety of all involved." As the crowd erupted into murmurs of protest, Jerry and Sally exchanged a glance. The truth of what they had seen would be buried, but the memory would haunt them forever. As the congregation reluctantly filed out of the church, an uneasy silence hung in the air. The once familiar sanctuary now felt alien, its sacredness tainted by the events that had unfolded. Whispers passed between those who dared to speak, their hushed tones filled with disbelief and fear. No one wanted to stay a moment longer, yet no one could entirely shake the feeling that leaving meant abandoning answers they'd never find. Jerry and Sally walked hand in hand, their steps slow and hesitant. The sunlight outside should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The bright, warm rays felt incongruent with the darkness that now consumed their thoughts. Sally clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles white. "Do you think it's really gone?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Jerry didn't answer immediately. His gaze was fixed ahead, scanning the empty parking lot as though expecting the creature, or worse, to reappear. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't think we'll ever forget what we saw in there." Behind them, the church doors creaked shut, sealing the horrors of the day inside. The pastor lingered on the steps, his expression unreadable, watching the last of his flock disperse. Standing beside him were the two men in dark suits, speaking in low, clipped tones. Every so often, their eyes darted toward the departing congregation, as though ensuring no one lingered too long or asked too many questions. As Jerry helped Sally into their car, she looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "Do you think it'll follow us?" she asked. Jerry hesitated, then shook his head. "No," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. As they drove away, neither spoke. The road ahead was empty, but the weight of what they had witnessed followed them, silent and unrelenting.